Welcome to our deep dive into Bitcoin and politics. You sent us some really interesting research and articles, and it looks like you want to learn how policy decisions could affect Bitcoin's future, especially here in the U.S.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting how Bitcoin, which was designed to operate outside of governments, is now at the center of all these policy discussions all over the world.
Exactly. So to help us figure this all out, we're going to look closely at Dennis Porter and the work that his organization, Satoshi Action, is doing. He's a big name in the Bitcoin world, and he's really pushing for states to adopt Bitcoin. He's even suggested using it as a strategic reserve asset.
That's right. And what's really interesting is that Porter isn't just talking about this. He's actually working on legislation to try to make it a reality. Satoshi Action's goal is to have states holding Bitcoin in reserve by, get this, 2025.
Wow. 2025 is right around the corner. So for people who might not know, can you explain what strategic reserve asset actually means?
Yeah, sure. Think of it like a country's rainy day fund. But instead of holding gold, which is what countries have typically held as reserve assets, they would hold Bitcoin. Porter says that Bitcoin is actually a much better option than the US dollar for long-term savings because there's a limited supply. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin.
That's a really interesting point. So he's basically saying that Bitcoin can't be affected by the same kind of inflation that can devalue traditional currencies, right?
Exactly. And he points to El Salvador, a country that has made Bitcoin legal tender, as a potential model for other countries to follow.
Okay, so that's the general idea. But how would this actually work in the U.S.?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that the US is already very much involved in the world of Bitcoin. It's actually the biggest holder of Bitcoin globally, both through private holdings and through Bitcoin that the government has confiscated.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah. And what's even more interesting is that this isn't a partisan issue. You have lawmakers on both sides of the aisle starting to pay attention to Bitcoin. They're starting to see its potential benefits, and that's led to a more, well, bipartisan approach to policy than you might think.
That's encouraging to hear. But I'm sure there are still challenges and disagreements along the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. For example, Porter talks about Texas a lot as a prime example of how complex this all is. Texas has seen both strong support for Bitcoin mining and strong opposition to it.
Why is that?
Well, it comes down to a bigger debate about Bitcoin's role in the energy sector. Porter is a big supporter of Bitcoin mining. He argues that it can actually have benefits for the energy grid.
Now, to be honest, whenever I hear about Bitcoin mining, I immediately think about the impact on the environment. How does Porter address those concerns?
That's a good point, and it's one that Porter acknowledges. He argues that the whole story around Bitcoin mining is changing. More and more miners are using clean and renewable energy sources, and it's not just for good PR, it actually makes sense economically.
How so?
Because miners are always searching for the cheapest energy sources, and these days, renewable energy is often the cheapest option.
That makes sense. So is Porter saying that Bitcoin mining could actually encourage more use of renewable energy?
Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. He often talks about how Bitcoin mining can help balance the grid by using excess energy, especially from sources like wind and solar, where the energy supply changes depending on the weather. The sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing, so there are times when we have more renewable energy than we actually need. And Bitcoin mining can be a consistent buyer for that energy, which would make those renewable energy projects more financially viable.
That's a really interesting point. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's a perspective that often gets lost in the debate about Bitcoin mining. And Porter uses a pretty striking example to make his point. He says that California alone is projected to have more wasted energy from wind and solar by 2030 than the bottom 36 nations combined. That's a huge amount of energy that could be put to good use by Bitcoin miners.
Wow, that's a crazy statistic. But let's be realistic, not everyone is going to be on board with this, right? What kind of pushback does Porter face?
Well, there is definitely opposition, particularly from some of the traditional energy companies, especially in Texas. Actually, Porter sees this pushback as a sign that Bitcoin mining is doing well. He thinks that these companies are trying to limit Bitcoin mining's access to the energy grid because they see it as a threat to their own profits.
So they're feeling the heat from this new technology.
Exactly. They're starting to realize that Bitcoin mining is really good at balancing the grid, and that's making them nervous.
It sounds like a classic case of disruption where new technology comes in and shakes up the status quo.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this is where Porter's message goes beyond just the technical side of Bitcoin mining. He's really passionate about the need for people who support Bitcoin to get involved in politics.
That's an interesting point. Why would people who support Bitcoin, who often value things like decentralization and independence from government, need to participate in the political process?
It might seem a little contradictory, but Porter argues that it's really important for protecting their rights to hold, use, and mine Bitcoin. He believes that without people being active and involved, governments could put in place regulations or even restrictions that would stop Bitcoin from growing. It's not about trying to control Bitcoin, it's about making sure it has the freedom to succeed.
So it's about being proactive and shaping the regulations rather than waiting and reacting to them after they're already in place.
Exactly. And Porter really emphasizes that the best way to advocate for policies that support Bitcoin is through education. He encourages people to share their personal stories about how Bitcoin has benefited them, focusing on things that lawmakers care about. Things like grid balancing, backup power during emergencies, job creation, and economic stability.
It's about showing the connection between Bitcoin and real-world solutions that people can understand.
Exactly. And Porter has some great examples to back up his arguments. He often talks about the winter storms in Texas Erie and Elliott, which showed how Bitcoin mining can actually help keep the grid stable during emergencies.
That's a powerful example.
And he points to the success that Satoshi Action has had in getting pro-Bitcoin laws passed in several states as proof that grassroots activism can really work. But of course, advocating for any kind of legislation takes resources. Porter admits that one of the biggest challenges for groups like Satoshi Action is a lack of funding.
So they need more support to really scale up their efforts.
Absolutely. They need more money to hire staff, travel to different states, and effectively lobby lawmakers.
That makes sense. Is there anything that the average person who supports Bitcoin can do to help?
Definitely. Porter encourages people to donate to organizations like Satoshi Action and to get involved in advocacy at the local level.
So it's a combination of financial support and getting people involved at the grassroots level.
Exactly. And Porter believes that if people who support Bitcoin work together, they can overcome these challenges and make sure that Bitcoin's future is shaped by those who understand and appreciate its potential. Now, all this talk about Bitcoin as a potential reserve asset and its role in the energy sector brings up a really big question. What about the US dollar? How do these two currencies fit together?
Yeah, that's a question that causes a lot of debate and speculation.
Some people think that Bitcoin will eventually replace the US dollar as the world's reserve currency.
That's definitely one possibility. But Porter, even though he's super bullish on Bitcoin, has a more nuanced view.
What's his take on it?
He thinks that Bitcoin and the US dollar will probably coexist for a while, at least for the foreseeable future. He sees stablecoins, which are cryptocurrencies that are pegged to the value of the US dollar, as a way for the dollar to reach more people globally.
So, stablecoins could act as a bridge between the traditional financial system and the crypto world. Exactly. They could make it easier for more people to use US dollars. But in Porter's view, Bitcoin is more than just a payment system. He sees it as the best technology for long-term savings. It acts as a safeguard against what economists call monetary debasement, which is basically when a government prints too much money and causes inflation.
So you're saying that Bitcoin could actually help keep governments accountable and prevent them from manipulating their monetary policies.
That's a big part of why so many people believe in Bitcoin. They see it as a way to protect their savings from losing value because of inflation.
That's a really interesting idea.
It is, and Porter takes it even further. He believes that as Bitcoin becomes more stable over time, it will become a more accurate measure of inflation than the statistics that governments release. It would be like a global inflation gauge.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So instead of relying on potentially manipulated government data, we could use Bitcoin to see the true rate of inflation.
Exactly. And this increased transparency could potentially lead to more responsible financial policies from governments.
That's a fascinating and maybe even a bit idealistic vision.
It is, but it gets to the heart of why so many people are so passionate about Bitcoin. They see it as a tool for making our financial systems more transparent and accountable.
It's about shifting power away from centralized institutions and giving more power to individuals.
Precisely. And that's a really powerful idea that resonates with a lot of people, especially in a world where trust in traditional institutions is declining.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. From Bitcoin as a possible strategic reserve asset to its role in the energy sector and its relationship with the US dollar, it's clear that this is a complicated and rapidly changing space.
It really is. And it's full of potential, both good and bad.
Before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, Bitcoin is no longer just a niche technology. It's becoming increasingly intertwined with politics and policy decisions around the world.
And second, even though Bitcoin is designed to be decentralized, being involved in the political process is crucial for its future. It's not about trying to control Bitcoin, it's about protecting its ability to grow and thrive.
That's a really important point. It might seem contradictory, but it shows how much of an impact policy decisions can have, even on something that seems as independent as Bitcoin.
Absolutely. And finally, it's clear that the future of Bitcoin and how it interacts with traditional financial systems is still unfolding.
It's up to all of us to engage in this conversation, learn as much as we can, and advocate for the policies that we believe will lead to a more open and innovative financial future.
Now, take a moment to think about everything we've discussed. What stands out to you the most? What are your thoughts on the idea of Bitcoin being used as a strategic reserve asset? How do you feel about the role of Bitcoin mining in the energy sector? These are just some of the many questions worth considering as we continue to explore the fascinating and ever-evolving world of Bitcoin.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Bitcoin and politics.
It's amazing how fast things are moving in this space. In the first part, we really dug into Dennis Porter's vision for Bitcoin and all the work his organization, Satoshi Action, is doing.
Yeah.
Now I think it's time to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Like, how is Bitcoin viewed by different political groups?
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the technical stuff and all the policy proposals, but in the end, Bitcoin's future depends on how the people in charge see it and understand it.
Right. And what's interesting is that Bitcoin seems to be gaining traction across the political spectrum. It's not this fringe idea anymore that only libertarians and tech people are into.
Yeah, you're right. I've noticed more and more politicians, even those who come from more traditional backgrounds, are starting to talk about Bitcoin.
Porter even mentioned that former President Trump has been to Bitcoin conferences and has said positive things about Bitcoin mining in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah.
I wonder if Bitcoin could become a key issue in future elections.
It's definitely possible. The fact that people who support Bitcoin are getting more involved in finance and politics suggests they're a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
Porter says this increased involvement is happening for two main reasons.
What are they?
Well, first, people who support Bitcoin really believe in its potential to solve some big societal and economic problems. They see it as a solution to things like inflation, financial censorship, and the fact that a lot of people don't have access to traditional banking.
So it's not just about making money, it's about making a fairer and more resilient financial system.
Right. And the second reason is that their financial well-being is often directly tied to Bitcoin's success. This gives them a strong incentive to get involved in politics and push for policies that help Bitcoin grow and get adopted more widely.
That makes sense. They have a personal stake in it.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really important point. Even though federal policy is important, Porter says that advocating at the state level is just as, if not more, crucial.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, states have a lot of power when it comes to regulating businesses and attracting them to their state.
Yeah.
And he thinks that if they can get enough states to adopt Bitcoin, it will eventually influence federal policy. It's a bottom-up approach that takes into account the different political views across the U.S.
So instead of trying to convince Washington, they're focusing on building support from the ground up.
Exactly. And it seems to be working. Porter mentions several states that have already passed laws that are friendly to Bitcoin. These states are putting in place regulations that encourage Bitcoin businesses to invest and innovate there.
Which states are leading the way?
States like Montana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Georgia have been really proactive. They see Bitcoin mining as a way to create jobs, improve their energy infrastructure, and attract investment capital.
That's interesting. What about the states that aren't so open to Bitcoin? What kind of arguments are they making against it?
Well, some are worried about the energy consumption of Bitcoin mining, even though, as we discussed earlier, there's a shift towards using renewable energy sources. Others are concerned about the possibility of criminal activity, even though Bitcoin transactions are actually very transparent and easy to track.
So it seems like there are still some misconceptions and fears that need to be addressed.
Definitely. And that's why Porter says it's so important to keep educating people and engaging with them. He thinks that a lot of lawmakers still don't really understand Bitcoin and its potential benefits. People who support Bitcoin need to be ready to explain the value of Bitcoin in a clear way, focusing on practical things that resonate with policymakers and the public.
I think that's a really important point. We can't just assume that everyone understands Bitcoin or that they'll automatically be on board. It's up to those of us who believe in it to make the case and answer people's questions.
Absolutely. It's about building bridges, not walls.
Now, speaking of building bridges, let's switch gears a bit and talk about Bitcoin's relationship with the government in general. It's a decentralized technology, which means it operates outside the control of any single entity. How do governments even approach something like that?
That's a great question, and it's one that policymakers all over the world are trying to figure out. Should they embrace it, regulate it, or try to fight it? These are tough questions, both ethically and practically.
I imagine there are some people in government who see Bitcoin as a threat.
Oh, there definitely are. Some see it as a challenge to their authority, while others worry about how it could affect the stability of the financial system. But there are also those who see Bitcoin as an opportunity. They recognize its potential to drive innovation, create jobs, and empower individuals.
So there's a wide range of perspectives, which makes this even more interesting.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to have thoughtful and informed discussions about Bitcoin's role in society. Porter believes that governments will eventually come to see Bitcoin as a valuable tool rather than a threat.
Do you agree with him?
I think it's definitely possible. As more people and institutions adopt Bitcoin and its benefits become clearer, it'll be harder for governments to ignore it. But it's going to take a lot of effort from everyone involved to create a regulatory framework that encourages innovation while also addressing valid concerns.
So it's about finding that balance between innovation and regulation.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance, but it's one we need to strive for if we want to see Bitcoin reach its full potential. Now, we've talked a lot about how Bitcoin supporters need to become more politically active. But what does that actually look like in practice?
That's a great question. What specific things can people do?
Well, Porter has some practical advice. He encourages Bitcoin supporters to reach out to their elected officials, go to town hall meetings, and participate in public hearings. These are opportunities to share their personal stories about how Bitcoin has made a difference in their lives and to advocate for policies that support its growth.
So it's about making your voice heard at the local level.
Exactly, and it's also important to support organizations like Satoshi Action that are actively working to get laws passed that are favorable to Bitcoin. These organizations are really important for amplifying the voices of Bitcoin supporters and making sure their interests are represented in the political arena. It's a team effort, and everyone's voice matters.
I think that's a powerful message. Even though Bitcoin operates on a decentralized network, its success ultimately depends on what individuals do.
That's a key point. The future of Bitcoin isn't set in stone. It's being shaped by the choices we make today.
So what does that mean for our listeners? What can they do to get involved?
I think the most important thing is to learn about Bitcoin and the issues surrounding it. Read articles, listen to podcasts, talk to people who know a lot about it. Once you have a good grasp of the basics, you can start talking to your friends, family, and people in your community. Help them understand what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. And if you're feeling really motivated, reach out to your elected officials and let them know where you stand on Bitcoin-related issues. Every voice makes a difference.
That's a great call to action. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complicated this all is, but in the end, it comes down to individual action.
Exactly. The future of Bitcoin is in our hands. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want you to think about this. If you could make one policy change to help Bitcoin grow, what would it be?
That's a good question to think about. Would it be to make the regulations around Bitcoin clearer? Would it be to encourage its use in the energy sector? Or something else entirely?
There's no right or wrong answer. The point is to think critically about how policy can shape the future of Bitcoin.
Yeah. It's a lot to think about.
It is.
We'll be back soon to explore this question further and finish up our deep dive into this fascinating intersection of Bitcoin and politics. But until then, I encourage you to really ponder that question. What one policy change could make the biggest difference for Bitcoin? Think about it, talk about it, and let's continue this conversation in the next part. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Bitcoin and politics.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring this intersection of Bitcoin and the world of
It
politics.
really has. We started by unpacking Dennis Porter's vision for Bitcoin. Then we look at its role in the energy sector and how it could impact the US dollar.
Right.
And now I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that question we left off with last time.
Ah, yes. The one policy change to help Bitcoin grow.
Yeah, it's a tough one to answer, isn't it? There are so many different things to consider.
It really is. But I think for me, it all comes down to education. I honestly believe the biggest thing holding Bitcoin back from being adopted more widely is just a lack of understanding.
I think I agree with you there. We've talked about all the misinformation and fear surrounding Bitcoin, but even beyond that, there's just a general lack of awareness about what it could do.
Exactly. So if I could just snap my fingers and change one thing, it would be to have really thorough Bitcoin education programs all across the country, maybe starting in schools, like as part of those financial literacy classes they already have.
That's a really interesting idea. Imagine if high schoolers were learning about Bitcoin right alongside traditional financial concepts.
Yeah, it would be huge. They'd grow up with a much deeper understanding of money, technology, and how the financial world is changing.
I can see how that would help demystify Bitcoin and get rid of some of the fear around it.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the younger generation. We need to educate policymakers, regulators, and the general public, too.
I've heard Porter talk about the importance of sharing those personal stories, those real-life examples of how Bitcoin can solve problems that people face every day.
Right. That's so important. Instead of getting lost in all the technical terms, we need to focus on the benefits that people can actually see and feel. Show how Bitcoin can give people more control over their finances, make the system fairer, and encourage innovation.
It's about connecting with people on an emotional level, showing them how Bitcoin could actually make their lives better.
Exactly. And I think that's something we haven't fully explored in our deep dive yet, the human side of Bitcoin.
That's a good point. We spent a lot of time talking about policy and technology,
Yeah.
but ultimately, Bitcoin is about people.
It is. It's about individuals who want more financial freedom and control over their own lives. It's about communities working together to support each other and create a better future.
And that's something that everyone can understand and connect with.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Bitcoin is more than just lines of code. It's a movement.
It's a movement driven by the belief that we can create a better financial system, one that's more transparent, more inclusive, and accessible to everyone.
And the success of that movement depends on each and every one of us. We all have a part to play, whether it's learning more ourselves, sharing what we know, or speaking up for policies that support Bitcoin.
Well, it's been amazing exploring the world of Bitcoin and politics with you.
The feeling is mutual. I've really enjoyed our conversations.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has helped you understand this complex and rapidly evolving landscape a little bit better.
Remember, the future of Bitcoin isn't set in stone. It's being shaped by the decisions we make today.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep asking those important questions.
Until next time.